We're here with Fatimah Azzahra Durkee. So Fatimah, you are here to present a design called Free City. Would you mind talking about that?
Well, it's a prototype for new cities in Latin America and the world. And it's based on some studies we were doing, seeing the patterns of migration globally due to people wanting to leave their countries in search of a better life, or due to war displacement, or due to natural disaster displacement, or just people migrating into cities in general to try and find a better life than they have in the country. So it was based on that, and then studies of special economic zones and free trade zones, startup cities, and trying to see how we could take both of these different things that were going on in the world and design for them to actually make something that's better than what's existing in China, for example. So we don't have these big industrial cities.
So what kinds of things would go into a design like that?
Well, I mean, from the beginning, we need to look at it from a much broader perspective, right? So we need to look at the politics, at the economics, we need to look at history, we need to look at different urban plans that have worked and that haven't worked. And then we need to start looking at the design, and we need to design for the large so that we have a framework that a city can grow into, but also for the small, so you have the life on the streetscape, and you have the actual quality of life of the people who move there and live there and work there.
You mentioned designing for the large and designing for the small, and it seems to hint at a tension that comes up a lot, which is how you can't plan the whole city comprehensively, but you also can't just not have anything there. So how do you resolve that kind of tension as a designer?
Well, I think you need to look into the infrastructure and frameworks and sort of, okay, people need sanitation, people need clean water, people need electricity, people are going to come if the city is successful. So how are those frameworks and networks set up from the beginning so that they're ecologically sustainable, so that they're dealing with new forms of technology, and so that even though the little parts of the city will grow into them, they're guiding it in a way, so that there's going to be a public space. And that space is going to be public no matter how dense it gets, so that the city can actually breathe. So those are the things that we need to study and understand and work with, and it's going to be different depending on the society, obviously, or the country or the climate,
So can you give me maybe a concrete example of how you might make a piece of this adaptable to the long-term growth or urbanization in a zone?
So the initial stage or initial geometry, well, we were looking into different geometries like radial cities that grew out radially, and hexagonal cities and grid cities. So basically what we did is we say there's going to be the radial streets so that the city can grow in any direction. There's going to be hexagonal connections that are going to connect those radial streets. And then within that, you're going to have a grid format for the blocks. So that's kind of how we dealt with it. And then from that, you're able to grow new sections. And basically, you have these central nodes. So you'll have a central node that's, say, a university. And then you'll have another central node that's, say, biotech. And then you'll have another central node for schools or for markets, startup companies. And those all interconnect, but they're in this framework that works geometrically.
How do you find that the design challenges for a situation like this differ from traditional urban planning or or say renovating or converting an existing city to a new urban design?
Oh, starting from the beginning. I think with starting from the beginning, you have a huge opportunity to not make the mistakes that you've seen made historically. So, so what has been done that was successful, what has been done that isn't successful. And I mean, a huge problem is slums, like most of these cities, these huge cities have slums all around them. Billions of people, millions of people, like around Mumbai alone. 20 million people live around there in slums. And so it's how do you design for that kind of rapid growth of people who are really poor, who are going to come to the city, So it's kind of trying to tackle questions like that if you can do it from the beginning instead of having to go back, it's prevention instead of cure. So that's important to think about.
At the beginning of this conversation, you mentioned the use of zones. So we've talked now a bit about the physical aspects of designing one of these things and that people are in search of a better life. I'm interested to hear, what role do the social areas like law and governance or education or those aspects of zones have for an idea like Free City? What I mean is that zones themselves they're more political or social than necessarily architectural. And so I'm curious to hear, what is the relationship between the social elements that are trying to provide people a better life and then the design elements that are trying to provide people a better life?
Oh, I see. Yeah. So through design, people can have a better life. I mean, we know that, right? If you have fresh air and clean water and a nice park to walk through and you don't feel like you're going to get stabbed or shot, like that's a better life. So how can we do that through a city, right? How do we make the streetscape alive so people don't feel dangerous, so that they feel like other people are watching over them? How do you enliven that through commerce? How do you have markets and things like that help with that? How do you design buildings so that they're cross ventilation? And how do you design things so that there's clean water and there's water collection and the water gets purified? And, so I mean, it depends on what life they're coming from, but I think that there's basic human things that we all need and that are good for all of us. And so it's just putting those into the design from the beginning. And I think that that's something that needs to be implemented in the actual political framework so that people abide to those rules and build in certain ways that are human friendly.
You mentioned slums, and then you finished just now talking about building in particular ways. I'm interested to hear more about a modular design that I saw earlier that seemed to be a mixture of design guidelines and then also physical technologies. Would you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a system we developed called Modular, and basically it's a sustainable brick. And we go into poor communities in Mexico, we're doing this right now, and we teach the people how to build a wall. And the wall becomes a room, and then the room becomes a house, and then the house becomes a street block, and then it becomes a city. And so it's a way of teaching people how to build safely so that their homes don't fall down, because we know that 80% of the people in Mexico build their own homes because they can't get financing to have them built for them. And it also gives them a sense that of ownership, that they own the place that they made and that they had a choice in what colors it was and things like that. So that's one way of approaching it, is saying, okay, we know that you're going to live here, and then here's a network you can plug into. So that's a part where the politics come in. It needs to be written into the system that you're going to have access to clean water and electricity, and then you can build this modular home on top of that. So that's one way.
Could you tell me a little more about the bricks? How do they work? How does it really become modular to that grand scale?
Well, it's just showing, it's like Tetris. It's like these go together and then they can fit together in a different way, and then they can fit together in another way. And then it was about trying to develop like a sustainable brick out of sustainable materials, with coconut fiber, for example, so that they're lightweight and they're not expensive. So it's a matter of how the rooms fit together. And then there's different sequences where you can have different courtyards, or you can have a different kind of sequence for a school.
If your efforts are successful and urbanization continues at the pace that's predicted, how do you imagine people living in cities in, say, 30 years, or by 2050, let's say?
I imagine that they all have access. I hope people have access to healthcare. I hope that they don't need that access because they have a healthy living environment, so they're not getting sick from their environment. I hope that everyone's able to get an education, and everyone's able to have clean water, and everyone's able to be at a certain standard of living where they can actually fully develop, and they're not going day by day trying to figure out how they can get food and if they're going to be able to bathe. And I know it sounds utopic, but I feel like through design we can actually try and accomplish a lot of those things, especially if we do it from the bottom up.
What do you mean from the bottom up?
Well, I mean, I think that there's ways of empowering people to help them make the change, to help them feel like they're part of changing their lives. I think there's most of the people, most percentage of humanity lives in the bottom, you know? The rich are the very top. And I think with cities, like what we're trying to do with special economic zones or with startup cities, especially startup cities, is we're trying to say, okay, and like in Honduras, 90% of the people working there have to be from Honduras. So basically we have to take this bottom group of people and help them have a better life, you know, and that's built into the political structure, which is another reason why politics and design working together can go hand in hand. Like what you were talking about with technology, you know, the trash picker who has an iPhone. It's like, how do we all develop at the speed of technology? How does design develop at the speed of technology to become really useful for humanity? What innovations can we hear from people that we wouldn't have imagined because we never had this way of life, or, you know, so things like that.
Thanks very much, Fatimah.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.